Hey there! In this skill builder video, I'm going to share with you how I like to do my paper piecing. If you're watching this video, you probably know that I really prefer freezer paper piecing, but sometimes paper piecing is just unavoidable. So I'm going to share what I do when I paper piece. And as I share with you how I do my paper piecing, I'll be piecing the diamonds from the Murmuration quilt pattern. Before getting started with the actual sewing, I'm going to walk you through a few things first. The first thing I want to show you is that when you print out your foundations, you want to make sure they print it out at 100% or full size, right? So in all my foundation patterns, you will find a 1-inch test square. So you just want to measure that and make sure it's 1 inches. And this one is measuring at 1 inches, so we are good to go. My next steps would be to cut out the foundation, right? I've already done that with these foundations. So I'm going to put these aside, and I'll put the ruler aside because I don't need that quite yet. So when I do any kind of foundation piecing, I usually set up some stations. So I've got my sewing machine, my sewing station here. I've got my pressing mat over here. I'm not really going to be using my iron a lot. I'll be using this nifty little rolling tool. I'll show you how. And then I have my cutting station, which is actually off camera right now, so I don't think you can see it, but it's within reaching distance. So those are my 3 stations I have set up: my sewing machine, my pressing station, and my cutting station. Normally, when I'm doing any foundation piecing, I also set up my entertainment station, and that's usually Netflix on my iPad for me. But I don't have that set up today because I'm filming, right? All right, so I'll be piecing the diamonds from the Murmuration quilt pattern. So I've got my fabric here. It's all set up right here. I'm working with one grouping here. This is probably my medium grouping. And I've got the fabric set up in the order that I want to go, roughly. Now, if the order changes a little bit, it's not a big deal. The Murmuration quilt pattern really lends itself to imperfections and fluctuations. So I'm not really too worried about the specific order. And I also want to mention that I pulled these strips from my scraps from my Murmuration quilt pattern. So it might be a little bit different from my actual quilt. And typically when I'm doing my foundation sewing, I like to sew in batches. So I prepared 4 foundations for me to work with today. I've got a couple without the seam allowance and I've got a couple with the seam allowance. So my preference is to foundation piece without the seam allowance here, but your preference might be to foundation piece with the seam allowance. Now, I will say the angle is a little bit tricky, and so if you happen to miss the seam allowance, then you won't be able to use your diamond. So I might recommend that you foundation piece with the seam allowance on so you can visualize the edges and the seam allowances better. But it's your preference. And with this color grouping, I'm making side justified diamonds. So I'll be sewing from dark to light. And also my sewing machine is set up. I've got a walking foot on. A walking foot is not necessary, but I find that it helps me. And I've got a walking foot, so why not use it? And then my stitch length is set to 1.8, which is a shorter stitch length than you would normally piece with. But the shorter stitch length is going to help me. It's going to help perforate the paper so that it's easier to rip off later. Okay, so let's get started with our foundation piecing. Now, the Murmuration diamond is improvisationally pieced, so that means you're going to be sewing a variety of widths of strips onto your diamond. So our first step for foundation piecing the Murmuration diamond is to start with fabric number 1, which is going to be in our center here. So I want these to go in this order. So I want to choose one of these fabrics that's in the center of my color grouping here. So let's choose this one. So when you're foundation piecing, you want to sew with the printed side of the foundation down when you're paper piecing. So you want to line up the center fabric with the vertical of the diamond, and you need to make sure that your fabric is long enough to cover both tips of the diamond. So I've got plenty of fabric up here and then plenty of fabric down here, of course. And then you want to baste this on. I don't usually baste, but if you want to baste this on, you can use pins or you can use glue basting. So I'm just going to pin this on for the video. And if you're using a print, you want to do the print side up. So right side up. And then the second thing you want to do is pick your next fabric. So you can go either way. It doesn't matter. So I'm just going to go this way, but you can go either way. You can go this way or that way, but I want the color to go in one direction. So I'm going to use this side for over here. So I'm going to pick out a second fabric. I'm going to line up the raw edges together. So I've lined up the raw edges together. You want to do right sides together and line up the raw edges together. And you want to make sure you have enough fabric that's going to cover the diamond. And so I have plenty here and plenty down here. And then my next step is to sew these. So as I sew, I'm going to stitch 1/4 inch away from the raw edge of the fabric. And I'm going to stitch right through the paper. And so I finished this first seam, and you can see that the seam is just about 1/4 inch away from the raw edge over here. And then my next step is to press the seam here. So I could do that at my pressing station, which is right next to me, or I can use this little rolling doohickey. So let me take these pins out. And typically when I'm paper piecing and I'm doing a lot of piecing and then pressing, piecing and pressing, I might set up my pressing station to be right next to me, or I might use this rolling tool. And this is it just presses just like that. So I'm rolling the seam. So this is how I would use the roller. Okay, so my next step over here is to choose my next fabric. And so I've got this really skinny piece right here. So let's use this really skinny piece. So I'm going to line up the raw edges, and I want to make sure I have plenty of room to cover my diamond. And now I can take this to my sewing machine and sew these. So again, I'm going to sew right about 1/4 inch away from the raw edges. Okay, I'm going to repeat the process. I'm going to fold this. Before I do, I'm going to get rid of this extra fabric here. So I'm just going to give it a rough snip, just so I'm not trailing all this fabric through my sewing machine each time. I'm going to put that back in order. I'm going to press this. So I'm just finger pressing, and I'm going to roll it. I'm going to get rid of this tail too. So I'm going to flip it over, just get rid of the extra tail so I don't carry it. All right, then my next step is to do another fabric. So I'm going to line up the raw edges. If you're using prints, you want to do right sides together. Okay, and I've got these roughly lined up together. So now I'm going to sew. Okay, I'm just going to snip off this tail here. Put that back in order over there, and then press this. Okay, so since I'm coming up to the last part, I'm going to press it with my iron this time. And I'm using a dry iron. I like to use a dry iron mostly. Okay, so right here, I've got a little bit of a problem that I want to show you. And it's actually pretty common when I sew these diamond foundations. So you'll notice I've got just a little piece of the diamond that's sticking out. And this happens quite frequently. So I've got a little bit of a diamond sticking out. So I'm not going to add any extra fabric here. But if you find that you end up with your fabric strip not covering where the seam allowance is going to be, then you'll want to add just another little extra piece of fabric right there. But in this case, I've just got a teeny tiny piece of this diamond sticking out, and it's going to be okay. So I'm going to let it ride for now. Okay, so I need to finish the rest of my diamond here. So I'm going to repeat the process. This time I'm going to go from the other side. I've got this nice bright blue that I'm going to use, and it's nice and thick. So I'm using a variety of widths. I'm going to line up the raw edges. I've got the right sides together. I'm going to stitch this now. Okay, this is stitched. I'm going to get rid of this tail. Put it back in my pile and press this. I'm going to roll it this time. Okay, then I need to add 1 or 2 more pieces of fabric here. And so it looks like I've got this nice dark blue, and it's really thick. So I'm going to use this. I'm lining up the raw edges, and then I am going to stitch it. And I'm going to get rid of this tail right here. And I think this should do it for completing my diamond. Yeah, plenty of room here. Okay. I've got my diamond covered all with fabric. So this diamond is finished. My last step is going to be to press it. All right. So I'm pressing my diamond, and I'm being sure to press and not iron. And it doesn't quite matter now because there's not a lot of biases in this diamond yet. All right, so I've got one diamond, all foundation piece. So you can see the entire foundation is covered by strips. And my next step with this diamond would be to trim the excess fabric from the foundation. I want to share with you a few different tips for troubleshooting piecing these foundation piece diamonds. So a couple things you need to look out for while you're piecing these foundation piece diamonds. One, you want to make sure that your strips are long enough. So as I was piecing these, I had a few instances where I didn't give my strips enough height to cover the entire diamond. And so I wound up with a few diamonds I couldn't use because there just wasn't enough fabric to cover the seam allowance and the diamond. So zooming in to give you a better look, you can see that this diamond right here, there's just not enough fabric to use this diamond. This wasn't a usable diamond. So as you are foundation piecing these diamonds, don't get too stingy with the height of these strips. And then the other thing you want to look out for is the side tips of the diamond. So I showed you a little bit of this earlier, but sometimes I wouldn't have enough fabric to cover the side of the diamond. So for example, sometimes my diamond, it would come out to be, I'd have like this much room left here. And so what I would do in this case would be to just add a tiny bit of extra fabric here and just sew that little bitty strip on. So that's how I manage that problem. Okay, so that is how I do my paper piecing when I have to do paper piecing. And I showed you how I do my paper piecing by showing you how I paper piece my diamonds from the Murmuration Quilt pattern. Typically, when I foundation piece, I love to use freezer paper. And in the next segment, I'm going to share with you how I freezer paper piece these diamonds. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next segment.